When he was 10 years old, Mateo Alvarez stood at the front of his fifth grade classroom in Austin, Texas, nervously gripping a paper with trembling fingers. It was his turn to present his science project, and although he had memorized every line, he could already feel the heat rising in his cheeks. He began to speak. "I did my project on solar energy," he said, his voice clear but tinged with the unmistakable rhythm of a Spanish accent. His parents had immigrated from Colombia when he was 6. Mateo had learned English quickly, but the melody of his native language still danced in his sentences. A few rows back, someone snickered. "Why do you talk like that?" A boy whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. More laughter, whispers, a mocking imitation. Mateo's ears turned red. He stumbled over his next sentence, then stared at his paper for what felt like forever. His teacher gently encouraged him to go on, but the words no longer came easily. When he sat down, the snickering hadn't stopped. The rest of the day and many days after, he barely spoke at all. That moment became a pattern. Mateo stopped volunteering in class. He avoided reading aloud. In group work, he let others speak. When people asked him where he was from, he'd mumble Texas and change the subject. At home, his parents noticed the change. "Mi amor, why don't you talk to your cousins on the phone anymore?" his mother asked one day. He shrugged. "I'm just tired." But it wasn't tiredness. It was shame. A shame that grew deeper every time someone mocked the way he said think as tink or three as tree. They didn't know how hard he tried, how many nights he repeated tongue twisters into a mirror, how often he replayed American YouTubers just to mimic their intonation. In high school, Mateo thought he had it figured out. Blend in. He practiced speaking in short, flat sentences. He avoided emotional conversations and focused on math, science, and computers, subjects that didn't require perfect pronunciation. Still, it hurt. During an oral presentation in sophomore English class, a girl raised her hand and asked, "Can you say that again? I couldn't understand you." The teacher shot her a look, but the damage was done. That night, Mateo skipped dinner, locked himself in his room, and didn't say a word to anyone. But then something changed. It was senior year. Mateo had to complete a mandatory public speaking assignment for graduation, a 5-minute speech on any topic. He dreaded it. His first idea was to do something safe, a speech about renewable energy or climate change. No one could make fun of facts. But his English teacher, Mr. Dalton, wasn't impressed. "I want to hear you, Mateo," he said, tapping a finger on the draft. "This is good, but it's hiding." Mateo looked up confused. "Hiding? Yes, behind data, behind graphs, behind safety. Tell me something only you can say." That night, Mateo sat in front of his laptop, staring at a blank screen. Hours passed. Frustrated, he opened a voice memo app and started recording without thinking. "My name is Mateo. I was bullied from my accent." He stopped, but then he pressed record again. And he didn't stop for the next 20 minutes. He told the app about the boy in 5th grade, the girl in sophomore year, the time he avoided calling customer service because he didn't want to be judged. He talked about his parents, who still spoke with pride in their accent, and how he felt like he was betraying them every time he tried to erase his own. When he listened back, he cried. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel small. The next day he rewrote his speech. This time, it wasn't about solar panels. It was about identity, about language, about being caught between two worlds. The speech was raw, vulnerable, and honest. When the day of the presentation came, his voice shook, but not with fear, with conviction. "Some people think having an accent means you're less intelligent," he said to the silent classroom. "But my accent is a map of where I come from, of who raised me, of the stories I carry. My accent is not a flaw. It's a feature." The room erupted in applause when he finished. A girl in the back even had tears in her eyes. Mr. Dalton gave him an A+. But what Mateo didn't know that day was that this speech would change the trajectory of his life. After the applause faded and Mateo sat back down, something inside him shifted. He had spoken, truly spoken, in front of a crowd for the first time without shrinking, without hiding, without trying to sound like someone else. And people had listened. For the first time, he saw that maybe, just maybe, his voice wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem had always been the shame that others planted in him. College, new city, same battle. A few months later, Mateo moved to Chicago for college. He thought a new city meant a fresh start, but the old insecurities traveled with him. In his first semester, he tried to keep his head down, stick to technical courses, avoid seminar classes that required long discussions. But on the second week of Philosophy 101, the professor, a sharp, intense woman named Dr. Lucille Grant, surprised him. "I want each of you to introduce yourself," she said, "and share one fear you have about speaking up." When it was Mateo's turn, he stood slowly. His chest tightened. "I'm afraid I won't sound smart enough," he said, his eyes on the floor. "Because of my accent." Silence. Then Dr. Grant leaned forward and said something that stayed with him forever. "Every accent is a story. Every story deserves space." After class, she stopped him and said, "You've got presence. You just need to stop apologizing for it." Discovering spoken word. Later that semester, a friend dragged him to an open mic night on campus. It was loud, full of rhythm, honesty, pain, and joy. Students performed poems about racism, gender identity, heartbreak, generational trauma, and they owned their voices. At first, Mateo just listened, but something stirred inside him again. A kind of hunger, a kind of itch. He began writing. Not science reports or essays, just raw reflections. One night, he signed up for the open mic. Hands trembling, he stood at the mic and recited a piece he called "Things I Was Afraid to Say." "I was afraid you'd laugh when I said tree instead of three. So I stayed silent, but silence is the loudest kind of surrender." The room went quiet, then someone snapped, then another. Then the whole room erupted in appreciation. For the next 2 years, Mateo became a regular in Chicago's spoken word scene. He performed poems about being first generation, about dual identity, about the beauty and burden of bilingualism. People came up to him after shows and said things like, "That's exactly how I feel. I just didn't know how to say it." He started recording his poems and uploading them to YouTube. One of them, titled "Accent," went viral. By the end of the week, it had 100,000 views. People from all over the world, India, Nigeria, Mexico, the Philippines, commented things like, "Thank you for speaking for all of us," the TEDx invitation. A few months after graduation, an email landed in his inbox. Subject, TEDx invitation. "We loved your poem." The organizer had seen his video and wanted him to speak at an upcoming TEDx youth event in Atlanta. Mateo froze. He reread the email 4 times. He almost said no. The voices of doubt returned. "You're not polished enough. Your accent is still there. TEDx is for eloquent people, for perfect speakers." But then he remembered 5th grade Mateo, the boy who was laughed at, the boy who stopped speaking, the boy who needed someone, anyone, to stand up and say, "You don't have to erase yourself to be accepted." So he said yes. And 3 months later, he stood under the red TEDx circle, lights blazing, heart pounding. His TEDx talk, "Your accent is not a mistake." "People ask me if I've tried to fix my accent," he began. "But what they really mean is, have you tried to sound more like us?" And my answer is, no. Because I sound like my mother singing lullabies in Spanish. I sound like my father reading the newspaper slowly, learning a new word every day. I sound like survival, like resilience, like 2 worlds colliding and creating something beautiful. When he finished, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. He didn't just speak that night. He reclaimed every word he'd once been too afraid to say. Today, Mateo Alvarez is now a published author, speaker, and educator. He travels the country giving talks on language, identity, and courage. He's spoken at universities, high schools, and community centers, always ending with the same message: your accent tells the world where you've been. Never let it silence where you're going. The video of Mateo's TEDx talk was uploaded the following week. In just 4 days, it had 500,000 views, then 1 million, then 2. Comments flooded in. "I've never felt seen until now. I stopped speaking up in meetings because of my accent. But today, I raised my hand. My son was bullied at school for the way he talks. I showed him your video. He smiled for the first time in weeks." People from over 70 countries reached out. Immigrants, refugees, international students, bilingual children, call center workers, nurses, professors, parents. His voice had become their mirror. Speaking became his mission. Mateo never planned to become a full-time speaker. He had studied environmental engineering, planned to work behind the scenes, quietly helping the planet. But now, he saw a different kind of planet that needed healing. one inside every person who'd ever been told their voice wasn't right. So he created the Accent Project, a nonprofit that hosts workshops for students and professionals who feel silenced by how they speak. They learn storytelling, confidence building, public speaking. Most of all, they learn that they are not broken. He visited high schools, especially in neighborhoods where immigrants made up most of the classroom. His talks weren't flashy. He stood at the front and told them the truth. I know what it's like to sit in the back because you're scared to speak. I also know what it's like to stop being afraid. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be who he needed when he was 11, sitting in a classroom, holding his words inside his mouth like they were poison. A boy in the back row. In one school in Houston, after he gave a talk, a quiet boy approached him after everyone had left. His name was Luis, and he said almost nothing, just handed Mateo a folded piece of paper. Later in the car, Mateo opened it. The note read, "I've been silent for 3 years. Today I spoke. Thank you for showing me how." Mateo stared at the words, eyes blurring with tears, because in that moment, he knew. Every insult he endured, every time he was laughed at, every word he was too afraid to say, it all led to this. Full circle. One spring morning, years after his TEDx talk, Mateo stood in his old elementary school in Austin, the same one where it all began. The principal had invited him to give a talk for their annual Courage Week. Before he began, he glanced out at the sea of small faces, many of them Latino, many of them wearing shy smiles, curious eyes, and he could hear voices still tinged with home. He told them his story. He told them that his accent had once been a target. He told them it had become his superpower. And then he said, "Raise your hand if you've ever been scared to speak." Nearly every hand went up. "Now keep it up if you promise you'll try anyway."
They did.
Final words. Mateo never erased his accent. He elevated it. He never tried to become someone else. He became more of himself. And today, he stands not just as a TEDx speaker, but as a reminder. When you speak, you teach the world to listen.